Thank you very much. Thanks, Anne, and thanks, David. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for organizing this event. Dear friends, just in time for its 75th anniversary, NATO has dropped its mask. And the NATO summit in Washington is one particularly illuminating moment in this revelation. The history of enlightenment teaches us never to accept a person's or an organization's self-image at face value. So do the early sources of enlightenment ideas in ancient Greece. The Greeks already possessed that insight. Inscribed above the temple of Apollo was the maxim, know thyself. If we make that injunction not lightly as a gentle reminder of the limits of human thought, but also as meaning what the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heracles insisted, that it belongs to all men to know themselves and think well, then we must regard self-knowledge as an essential human quality, which perhaps also ought to apply to our organizations. With NATO, however, it seems to be exactly the reverse. For NATO, denial of its true nature is part of the essence of the organization. Or put it another way, an almost meditative immersion in its own self-image is part of the essence of the military alliance. It is all the more astonishing then that Western media are so often content to reflect 1,000 iterations of this self-image back to the public without question and without pausing to consider whether the image adequately represents reality. In fact, 75 years of NATO is equivalent to 75 years of denial, though with a dramatic expansion of scale and scope in recent years. This is so in part because the three great myths of NATO are now fading. First, it is the central myth of a NATO organized as a defense community committed to international law. A NATO that is a community of constitutional states upholding the law, allowing international law to rule its action so that it exists for no other purpose but to defend the territory of its members. Yet, if we interrogate NATO's actual policies, what do we find? In 1999, NATO itself conducted a war of aggression in breach of international law against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. NATO's war crimes included the bombing of a television station in Belgrade and an allegedly accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy, which killed 3 Chinese journalists. In 2011, NATO attacked Libya. It misused a UN Security Council resolution to fight a war for regime change, one result of which was that part of the country came under the rule of jihadist and Islamist group. Libya on the whole was plunged into a state of appalling misery and even suffered the return of slavery. In Afghanistan, NATO involved itself from 2003 in a war far from alliance territory, only to hand power 20 years later to the Taliban. Those overthrow had been the invasion's stated objective. That 20-year war in Afghanistan was marked by multiple war crimes, such as the October 2015 US airstrike on a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, which, needless to say, went unpunished. NATO has assumed the Musketeers' motto, all for one, and one for all. This means, in practice, that the deeds of individual NATO members must also be ascribed to the organization itself. Brown University puts the death toll of the US wars in the Middle East over the last 20 years alone at 4.5 million people. Wars like that in Iraq, based on lies and which were nothing but egregious violations of international law. NATO's self-image as a community of defense in adherence to international law simply does not match reality. We must rather draw the opposite conclusion. NATO is a community of illegality and of the violators of international law who, either separately or as an organization, conduct wars of aggression on a politically opportunistic basis. A second myth, perhaps the one most insistently impressed upon the public, is that of NATO as a community of democracies grounded in the rule of law. But if we examine the past with any care, this flattering self-presentation is immediately deflated by an ugly and shameful past. Until 1974, NATO member Portugal was ruled by a fascist dictatorship which waged blood-soaked colonial wars in Angola and in Mozambique. Those who resisted were driven into concentration camps like in Tarrafal in Cape Verde, where many Angolans and Guinea-Bissauans were tortured to death. Like fascist Portugal, Greece and Turkey, both were members of NATO in the aftermath of their respective military coups. NATO itself, as we now know, put into motion Operation Gladio, a clandestine organization to be activated whenever democratic majorities threatened to vote against NATO membership. In Italy, for example, terrorist attacks were carried out in the name of far-left groups so as to discredit the Italian Communist Party in its effort to form a government. One might object that here we are referencing a bygone era and that NATO now stands ready to be called up in the global fight by democrats against autocrats. But in this point too, any serious observer must conclude that something is amiss in that aspect of the 21st century alliance's self-image. Take Turkey under President Erdogan. It has repeatedly conducted illegal wars against Iraq and Syria, supported Islamist jihadist terrorist groups in Syria, and, according to the German government's own assessment in 2016, is a launchpad for Islamists. Yet Turkey has always been and remains to this day a valued NATO member. Bilateral security agreements, such as those struck with Franco's Spain, are now in place with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, even in the full knowledge that these states are avowedly anti-democratic. Clearly, the only meaningful criterion for dealing with the alliance is geopolitical advantage. NATO is neither a collective of democracies, nor does it exist to defend democracy. Third, NATO presently claims to be safeguarding human rights. And even if we were to overlook how NATO's actions trample on the rights to work, health, and adequate housing 1,000,000 times over, amidst growing poverty and a historic upward redistribution of wealth domestically, such a self-serving image does not withstand scrutiny in international matters. As we debate here today, prisoners taken in the US so-called global war on terror still languish in Guantanamo Bay, where they have been kept without trial for nearly a quarter of a century. That is the reality of human rights in NATO's leading state. When it comes to freedom of opinion and the press, the US, supported by its NATO allies, attempted to make an example of Julian Assange by tormenting him for 14 years. His sole crime was having revealed US war crimes to the public. A smear campaign was then launched against him. Hillary Clinton and Mike Pompeo openly contemplated his murder. This is a bit of the reality of NATO's relationship to human rights. And I'm thrilled to be able to say, finally, that my friend Julian Assange is now a free man. And also important, Julian is undefeated, dear friends. The international campaign for Assange, all of the confidential diplomatic talks and the like, were in the end successful. But we must also realize that the fight for Julian's freedom was also a part of the struggle for freedom itself. And this struggle continues to rage here at the very heart of the NATO system. Given the density of the propaganda, how tireless it operates in celebration of the NATO mythology, day in and day out, it is almost a miracle that not only is support for NATO crumbling worldwide, but that it is precisely those most exposed to its propaganda who are increasingly skeptical of the military pact. In the United States, public approval of NATO has been falling continuously over recent years, while majorities in Germany question the principle of defending all members. That is, they are no longer prepared to commit themselves to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Why is that? Why are people starting to have doubts about NATO, despite the onslaught of propaganda? The answer is simple enough. NATO is itself causing this crisis, and people sense that. While its defenders speak of the alliance as if it were eternal, the organization's drive toward escalation in Ukraine and its expansion into Asia is exceeding the alliance's own capacities. Just as with most empires, NATO is falling into a self-made trap of overextension. And in this regard, NATO is a political fossil, unprepared to learn from the defeat of the German Empire in the First World War, and appears to be repeating the gross miscalculations of the Kaiser's Germany only on a global scale. The German Empire believed it could wage a war on two fronts. Today, a similar conviction is gaining traction within NATO that it must not only confront Russia and China, but that it is also to involve itself in the Middle East. This is a claim to global hegemony now under formulation. What hubris! NATO evidently sees itself waging a war on three fronts. But if it were to do this, its defeat would be certain right from the start. Given this, it is only logical that 3 particular meetings are planned for this week's NATO summit. The first is a working session devoted to further ramping up the alliance's own rearmament. The NATO-Ukraine Council is next on the agenda. It is to discuss how the lavish financial transfers and pledges from NATO to Ukraine can be augmented with an increase in arms deliveries and eventual NATO membership for Ukraine. Third, there will be a session with the Asian-Pacific Forum, or Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, and a meeting with the leaders of the European Union. 75 years after it was founded, NATO is to push for stepped-up belligerence in Ukraine and expansion into Asia. The intention is to advance the NATOization of Asia and to put the strategy it believes it has already deployed successfully against Russia in place there. For the moment, the primary focus in the Pacific is not on direct NATO accession for Asian countries, but rather on the expansion of NATO's sphere of influence via bilateral agreements. And not only with the Asian Pacific Four, but also with the Philippines, Taiwan, and Singapore. Just as Ukraine was erected as a frontline state against Russia, NATO is hoping to transform Asian countries like the Philippines into challenger states vis-à-vis China. The initial aim is to engage in a cold proxy war, but at the same time to prepare for a hot US and NATO proxy war in Asia. And just as NATO enlargement was pursued under the boiling frog principle with regard to Russia, so with enlargement proceeding incrementally so as not to arouse Russia's suspicion too much, the policy of containing China now is comprised of lining up states one by one into a phalanx ready for war. The goal is, as ever, to avoid having to fight such a war oneself, but to be able to access allies' resources so as to conduct these cold and then hot wars. These developments are flanked by economic warfare, which is now also being directed against China, and the main burden of which is borne by the economies of US client states. The US and NATO are in fact pursuing a method of war laid out by the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, who counseled that warfare not employing one's own resources was that type a state should aspire to wage. The problem for NATO strategists here is not only their willingness to set fire to the entire world, but also the self-imposed risk posed by their global pretensions, which only fosters alliances among those states rejecting NATO. Indeed, NATO policy played a major role in the rise of the BRICS countries, as that grouping is for many states a means of protecting their own sovereignty. Paradoxically then, if there are forces now promoting a multipolar world, the US and its NATO allies must be considered among the most significant. That's all about dialectic. Even states like India and Vietnam are refusing to subordinate themselves to NATO strategy. And with its unconditional support, to the far-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, NATO is losing all moral legitimacy in the global south as it is seen to be complicit in Israeli war crimes. As already mentioned, public support for a NATO committed to escalation and expansion is crumbling in the West. In Germany, 55% of people reject Ukraine's accession to NATO. The majority opposes supplying arms to Ukraine and desires an immediate ceasefire. In the United States, financial aid to Ukraine, $200 billion so far, has become extremely unpopular. Growing numbers of people want a stop on the flow of money to a system in Kiev, which is not only corrupt, but honors a far-right state cult around the Nazi collaborator and mass murderer Stefan Bandera. Dear friends, NATO's myths are losing their luster. The alliance's strategies are falling to their own imperial overextension. What we need now is an immediate end to arms deliveries to Ukraine and, at long last, a ceasefire there. Those who seek peace and security for their own populations must halt the aggressive policy of expansion into Asia. Ultimately, the fight against NATO is a fight for one's own sovereignty. As an alliance of client states, Europe is in danger of collapsing. Emancipation, as seen in Latin America, has yet to materialize. A first step would be to stop letting ourselves be played for fools by a military alliance that funds its aggressive strategy with a social war waged by its constitutive governments against its own populations. Therefore, I thank you for your attention and for having me in this event. Thank you.